and pleasure with the right kind of attitude.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, Alice and Robert, feel free to chime in anytime. Okay.
Yeah, I mean that sounds very zen-y too.
Yeah.
It's like it's completely irrelevant what you're. I mean, I think I've learned from your class just how important these kind of mundane or what active uh, efforts to put yourself in the right position, but ultimately it should be on condition anyway.
Right. With that said, I could also speak about the issue from a completely opposite direction,
Mm,
right? Why is it that in the normal description of jhanic progression, you start out with happiness, pleasure, and you end with equanimity? Why do you have to go through this sequence? It's actually quite important that first you have access to, say, a healthy sense of self, to have like wholesome kinds of happiness before arriving at peace. There are quite a number of benefits, but one is that when we're practicing letting go, which is
mhm.
really what the Buddhist meditation ultimately about, right?
Yeah,
Leading to letting go, maturing, letting go. Letting go is not created equally. Do you let go with this thoroughgoing mindset, with this very clean mindset? That's it. And there's no hesitation, there's no fear, there's no subtle clinging. It has to do with your integrity, with the happy mindset that you set up
mm,
beginning. So if you're someone who's already been acclimatized, properly conditioned to the right kinds of happiness, then it's like there's sufficient maybe courage on your part, sufficient conviction on your part. When you let go with the right kind of attitude.
right.
Some people they let go with a little bit of sour grape. Some people let go with a little bit of complaint. Some people let go with a little bit of indulgence and self-pity. And whereas, if your mind has already been properly set up with happiness, with pleasure, and so forth, you let go. Thoroughgoing,
Right.
unreserved. Yeah.
So I'm curious how, and I asked you this earlier this semester, but the kind of, you know, Zen-like great doubt, just
Yeah.
painful, whatever, that
Yeah.
appears, I don't know, I have no personal experience with it,
Yeah.
but like appears like it's like, in result the same thing, but it sounds so contrary to,
Yeah, so here's my take on it. Okay, I don't presume to know very much about it because I didn't spend too much time in Zen. But I found that having keen interest, having great curiosity, just being greatly aroused by something that intrigues your mind, are wonderful motivators, right? So um, the reason that I, if I may say so, practice with the zeal that I did was because I was genuinely intrigued. I was like, what the heck is this thing called self? It's like this big puzzle in my mind. And I'm like, if this puzzle isn't resolved, even when I find myself in the midst of sensual pleasure, I can't really enjoy. It's kind of like a secondary concern. Like in comparison to this great big question, like this thing called self, this thing that I experience is subjectivity. Do tables have that? What is it like when I become a table? I'm genuinely intrigued by such a question. So I was like probing the mind with, I guess, sufficient ferocity. And that allows me to gain access to layers that would otherwise not be accessible to people who just have a very superficial interest in such a matter. So I see great benefits in the great doubt sort of approach. But on the other hand, I also see Zen practitioners coming down with Zen illnesses, right? There are voluminous treatises dedicated to the issue of resolving Chanbing, Zen illnesses.
mm,
Where did it come from? It comes from you're being beset with this keenness to resolve your issue. What is this thing? It's bothering me so
mm,
much. There's a downside to that, right? And this is why I believe that when the Buddha talks about the mental qualities are helpful to spiritual practices, he talks about moderating them, balancing them, holding them together, and things like that, right? So if you have the right amount of keen interest, that qualifies as piti, that qualifies as happiness. When you're inquiring into the nature of your mind, right? You do so because you're interested in it. I'm doing something very meaningful compared to when I am, doing some idle pastime. I'm more happy when I'm looking into the mind,
Right.
right? And then on the other hand, you could do it in such a way that your body is greatly agitated. Your nervous system is like frazzled.
Yeah. That's why I became a little disenchanted, because it was just stressful,
Yeah, you look at historical figures like Thomas Edison, right? So there are bouts of workaholism on his part where he just lose track of time, day and night, just immersed in his pursuit, and grows and loving every minute of it. But then there are also occasions when people around him report how, he's all looking disheveled and, obviously sick, and yeah. So, a good meditator, someone with sufficiently developed awareness, is one that has a all-rounded awareness, right? So, yes, you are focused on this issue, but then at the same time, you're like, how am I doing? Is this sustainable? How long can I keep it up?
Mm.
Is this taking me anywhere? Right? Am I getting closer to the goal? Right? Is the goal a viable one? Is it achievable one in a reasonable amount of time? You're performing that kind of diagnosis at the same time.
Mm.
Wisdom is not, like this very narrow, one-faceted thing. Wisdom is discernment all around. Yeah.
Thank you.
I met friends, who were perfect nerds in my graduate years, as you can imagine, right? Being a, prestigious graduate program, and you have very brainy people from all over the world. Like I had this friend who can speak 7 languages fluently, and even when I take him to a theater, like a movie theater, he would flip out his grammar book. He would be studying Arabian grammar, Russian grammar, like something like that, right? But then, when I drive him home, I drop him off, like literally 30 yards from his apartment. He would end up becoming lost. He would like have problems finding his way back to his apartment. So some people are like that. They're kind of reminiscent of what's that syndrome called? Kind of like autistic. There's another one, Burgers. Asperger's. Thank you, Asperger's syndrome. Right? They're just so singularly developed in one area. And ideally, a meditator shouldn't be like that.
Right.
The meditator should be aware of, say, for example, his effect on the people around him. Is he caring for the people around him sufficiently that these people are, like later on, you don't experience remorse. You don't feel like you've been a delinquent husband, delinquent father, right? And you're looking after your physical health, and so on and so on.
Right.
In the end, I'm a student of comparative religions. So when it comes to the Buddha's insight on not self, I'm impressed, but I'm not all that impressed, right, compared to what I've learned from the other religions. But there's one thing about the Buddha that was truly impressed, and that was his pedagogy, his teaching style, the way he addresses the different aspects, the way he prescribes very rounded approaches, pleasant abiding here and now. How do you be an effective meditator and then at the same time you're happy at the beginning, happy in the middle, happy in the end, and you don't disrobe? and then your
Yeah.
sasana will be long lasting, will continue to be a positive presence in the society.
Right.
Yeah, it's just incredibly impressive
Yeah.
for me. Yeah.
It's shocking how pragmatic it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah,
Hard to, yeah.
yeah. The sort of monastic peers I would look for, right? So people will go, oh, I want an arahat monastic peer. So well, if you have that, that's great. Right? But under normal circumstances, what sort of people you want to have in your sangha? You want well-rounded.
Right.
They don't have to be super smart, but they have to be sensible, right? They have to be easy to communicate with, right? They have to be responsible minded. They want to, right? If you're an arahat and who's like very messy, who's like oblivious of his surrounding, I'm not sure if that's necessarily a blessing to a community. Yeah.
That's interesting. What other religions have you been particularly
Particularly
impressed with?
Hinduism.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. To a lesser extent, the other religions, but
Mm. Hinduism is a broad whole or
yeah.
specific?
Yeah. And, I'm particularly interested in contemplative
Mm.
schools, right? Liberative,
Yeah.
supramundane aspects,
Mm.
lineages. You look at the Buddha's advice to people in general, in the early suttas. He doesn't uphold Panya Paramita as this end all be all. Just have this, and everything else will fall in place. No, he gives people very practical advice like be upright, be capable, right? Be easy to instruct, right? Be very easy to support, meaning that you're not going to be too much of a burden to your followers, to your devotees,
Right.
right? Like be modest. Um, the things that you do really bring your mind to it, whether it's sewing cloth, right?
Yeah.
Fixing a roof, right? Things like that. That's the sort of lessons he impart to his disciples. Yeah.
This is like an impossible question, but
Mhm.
I mean, how rare do you think these kind of super mundane attainments actually are? Are they, are you gonna find like if you take 100 dedicated Hindu practitioners, you're gonna find like 10?
Yeah, very, very hard for me to
Yeah.
say. Yeah, but of course, um, the first impression is that there are very, very few, right? I mean, even in a Buddhist university like this, if you talk to people, then you will quickly be able to pick up whether or not there's any sort of supramundane streak in them, interest in them, right? Or they're preoccupied with something that's nominally Buddhism, but has really little to do with
The ultimate goal.
exactly.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So like my temperament is such that I'm introverted, I'm shy, I hate public speech, and so forth. I give lectures because that's one of the occupational hazards, But um, but then occasionally there are people like yourself who are genuinely interested in the supramundane. And I would feel, like motivated to share what I know. But then on most semesters, that isn't the case. I'm obligated to go through the motion. It's to me, it's a pretty painful thing
Mm.
to have to speak and
Yeah,
then realizing there's right.
Yeah.
There's no resonance, right? There's no receptivity. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about really quickly, the one meditative technique that it's been very useful. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think it's not an end goal, but you were kind of describing like the treating like a projector screen, like as if this is,
Yeah.
all of this is being perceived.
Yeah.
There was something after that I don't recall, that once you kind of been able to realize that perception or use that perception, where do you go from there?
Okay, so there are many different kind of perceptions that are useful. And so long that these perceptions are used in a way where you keep in mind that they're being used to weaken either your sensuality or conceit, then they're pretty much acceptable or recommended tools by the Buddha, right? So one such perception will be the not a thingness perception, where you see that as far as all experienced phenomena are concerned, there's no duration to them. They're in a state of pure flux, right? They only remain a thing as an idea, as a concept. But in real experience, it's almost like as if the Greek philosophers described, they dip their toe into the river, but by the time the toe is lifted up, it's no longer the same, right? It's like as soon as you think that you cognized something, the thing is no longer, right? So, and when you really go into such a perception and stabilize it, and within this frame, you remember to use it to weaken your essential craving. It's very, very powerful. What is it that I'm trying to land on? What is it that I'm trying to seize hold of?
Right.
Yeah, when you say that, okay, I want to make sure that this relationship lasts with my wife, with my girlfriend, with my partner, whatever. Okay, and then you go, where's the person that you're trying to build this relationship with?
Right.
There's only just pure flux. Yeah.
Is there benefit to utilizing that perception? I mean, like a toolkit, or is there a benefit to like, okay, 24/7, my mind is just gonna continuously.
You could do it depending on your willingness and what you can afford to. There are people who could, we're very interested in, they can stay in this perception all day long. And it's almost as if you're wearing tinted glasses. Everything you see is yellow because you're wearing something yellow.
Right.
Yeah. It would be very useful if a meditator has had a sort of deep samadhi experience where she is just completely immersed in a perception of singleness. Everything is dropped.
Right.
And very end, you continue to work on a satipatthana theme.
Right.
You will notice how powerful that is. Like after that one single day, you'll come out a different person. And then earlier you made mention of the projection, the projector thing. I also find that perception to be very useful. Most of us think of the waking hours as the most real of all the experiential states compared to, say, when you're asleep, compared to, say, when you're dreaming. But then a meditator would increasingly doubt that, maybe to the point where that order is completely reversed. And how so? Well, your wakeful state consists of, at least for most people, a sort of narrative, a sort of storytelling that is ongoing. Okay? But there are so many gaps in the story. It's just that we are so fixated on the content part that we become oblivious to the gaps. There are actually way more gaps than the story. So if someone were to ask you to tell your story, and you're trying to give an autobiographical account of the past, it'd be a highly, highly selective one, right? There are a few highlights. Number one, you're able to remember. And number two, even the parts that you remember, they're greatly amended, embellished. Right? And that's like our wakeful hours too. We think that intention is me. But no, intention is so few and far between compared to, say, peace. Intention is so disparate and going all over the places. And I mean, if what you're identifying is what is underneath, is the substrate, right, as opposed to intention, then you clearly see it. Why is it that people are obsessed about saving face, about presenting a certain self, when that's just like a projected thing?
Right.
We would see the ludicrousy of it all.
But you said one thing on, when you hold a perception like that, and um, is it what's the function of, I guess, what's the difference between just saying directly, I'm going to let go of intention and just try to step back as much as possible versus, okay, I'm going to focus on body in and of itself as deeply as possible. Why not just skip to the?
Yeah. So for the Buddha, to arrive at a formless perception, there are two ways. One is you give attention to that particular perception. The other one is you drop all the other extraneous, irrelevant perceptions. There are two approaches, right?
So those are two approaches?
Those are the two approaches that the Buddha talked about. So for example, with regard to the base of boundless space, one way to go into it is by visualizing boundless space. The other way of going into it is by dropping perceptions of form.
Right.
Perceptions of material resistance.
Right.
Right. Now, the suttas didn't say the following, but it is of my opinion that the second approach is way more efficient.
Of dropping?
Dropping, than picking up, than visualizing. Visualizing is tiring, right? Whereas dropping, it's very easy. And if you go into the formless by using the second approach, it's way more sustainable. And it will take you to, for lack of better terms, you're getting closer to the substratum experience.
Right.
Because visualization is an added sankhara.
Right.
Right? And whereas if you go in there by dropping the unnecessary sankhara, it constitutes greater rest. And you arrive at the deeper layer of this layer bundle called your being.
And ultimately you have to drop anyway, so that also. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So to answer your question, there are many different ways of doing it. And the thing about meditation techniques in Buddhism is that you don't use it the same way throughout. You keep examining the way you use it so that there's always room for improvement. You're refining it.
Right.
You're performing, once again, diagnosis. And you go, do I have to strain so hard? Do I have to cock my eyes when I concentrate?
Yeah.
Do I even need to use attention as a way of observing phenomena? Can I use natural awareness? Things like that. You keep working, and then in general, you are inclining towards effortlessness. You're inclining towards the dropping of fabrications.
Right. And this is very quick, silly question that, and then you can, the Zen answer is like 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
How much, given a job and whatever, but if you're willing to, how many hours would you sit or any kind of meditation?
So people are different, right? So I know myself when I started practicing, I know how lazy and untrustworthy I am. So I know I'm the sort of person who needed discipline, who needed structure.
Yeah.
Or there are people who don't. Really, I've seen that sort of people, right? The different academic advisors I had when I was a graduate student, right? There was a professor who was just very kind to me, very generous. But in all honesty, the one professor that I really benefited from was a disciplinarian who yelled at me. It was no, blah, 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 right? He would give me sometimes completely unreasonable demands.
Yeah.
Like when I asked him, how do I navigate dissertation writing period in my life, which is very stressful, all that. You're all consuming. And the first professor told me, take care of yourself, right? Remember to exercise, right? Blah, 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 blah. The second professor tells me, give up your social life. Give up your exercise routine, right? Give up, blah, 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 blah. It's really in following the second professor's advice that I was able to basically set a record for the department in terms of time to completion. Anyways, so I know myself. So I set up this daily routine. I treat as rituals.
Right.
2 times a day at least, right? Each time has to be, 50 minutes at least, right? Something like that, some kind of regimen. And then the second part is you ask yourself, why are you practicing? Why are you practicing the Dharma? Um, and if your motive is genuine, right? If you're motivated by the right kinds of motive, there's going to be passion on your part. There's going to be like sense of urgency on your part, and you'll find ways. If you're not properly motivated, I don't care what tricks you use, how many hours of meditation you're prescribed, to do, and that's not going to work. In the end, it's something else is motivating you.
Right.
You have to examine that. Yeah. And even if you're a layperson, if you have a busy schedule and so forth, so long you're sufficiently interested, you'll find a way. Even for the 2 seconds in between, like during the pauses in a conversation, the 5-second pauses in a conversation, finding ways to insert some dharmic dosage into that.
Just without, just endlessly, intentionlessly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jim. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dr. Chu.
Hey, hello, Jared.
Hey, technical issue. My camera's not working today, so
Okay.
yep. How can I like get into the state where I'm like a mirror, where I effortlessly reflect all phenomenon?
Okay. I would recommend you're trying the following practice. You do this while lying down. You don't have to do this while you're sitting up in the typical formal sitting postures. You lie down in a corpse posture and relax as much as you can. Remind yourself to entrust your body completely to gravity. Relax all your muscles to the best of your ability, right? And you relax. You relax deeply. Now, as you do so, chances are you may experience drowsiness because it's the mind's natural response to relaxation, right? But then you want to remind yourself to relax into heightened sensitivity, not relax into dullness, not relax into sleepiness. Okay, so once you get used to it, you will find that relaxation doesn't trigger automatically dullness, torpor, and so forth, but rather you're becoming aware of things very subtle that typically elude your attention, like these bubbly sensations in the body, electrical currents in the body, or subtle thoughts, subtle exertions, subtle worries, that sort of thing. That's the state you want to put yourself in. And it's in that state you continue to probe and inquire, how can I relax? How can I continue to relax without compromising lucidity? Okay. So this is how you would eventually arrive at understanding that awareness can be described as being close to non-fabrication. You could argue it's non-fabrication already in itself, or you could say it's close to non-fabrication. It's very hard to describe. It's very, very hard to measure once you get to that point. But nonetheless, once you get to that point, you'll find that awareness, whether it's fabricated or not, is a very, very sustainable tool. You could use it for hours on end without you're getting bored, without you're getting tired, right? And if let's say you already learned the technique to utilize natural awareness as your satipatthana tool, as opposed to using onerous, forceful attention as your primary tool. And then you are able to practice in such a way for a certain amount of time, let's say 2 hours, right? And after 2 hours, you begin to feel a little fatigue, a little boredom, whatever the case might be. Then you ask yourself, if indeed This is non-fabricated. This is effortless. What's causing the fatigue? What's causing the boredom? You ask yourself that, and you try to discover the cause. You keep ferret out the causes. And you realize that those causes are not natural awareness. Those causes are what natural awareness are aware of. You repeat this process, and you arrive at more and more effortless type of awareness. And it's not just that that kind of awareness is a very powerful tool. It's not just that, but that even in the process, you have a good chance of understanding what is Nibbana. Nibbana being a resolution of fabrication, right? Being the relinquishment of acquisition.
When I'm starting out developing this heightened sensitivity, should I also be doing Satipatthana or just this heightened sensitivity?
It's up to you. I mean, if you find it easy to do it, you could do it. But what I've personally found useful is first I discover things that are about my body. Very specifically, subtle temperature variations, like the subtle fires, the subtle ripples of warmth happening in the body, electrical currents, bubble-like sensations in the body. Then I learned to kind of soak myself in the jacuzzi, so to speak. Right? In the heightened sensitivity, the bubbles are so vivid that the experiencing of them constitutes a kind of massage, constitutes a kind of pleasant experience. It's kind of like you're sitting in the jacuzzi. So for me, that particular approach is useful because I'm happy to stay in it for a long time. Right? It is possible that you become so sensitive, right? And you become so relaxed that you begin to discover that what is this body that I'm supposed to have? In what sense is it a body? The boundary is something that I added mentally. The mind is busy in demarcating, in conceptually, incorporating it. And then there are these sensations that are just effervescent. Right? There are many things you can do while you're in the state when you're so relaxed and your sensitivity is heightened, and then you discover this layer of your being that defy your normal way of thinking who you are, what you have. It's because I consider it that it's because I've had this experience that later on when I experimented with the formlessness, it became an easy endeavor for me. Because at that time I already, largely disabused myself of the idea that I really have this body and that the body is really this material thing, this corporeal.
And I'm struggling with tension in my meditation in a few different ways, and also some of it is lasting outside of meditation.
What was the first part? You're experiencing difficulty with what?
Tension.
Tension? Okay.
Yeah. So when I do the Dhamma base on thoughts, seeing the drawbacks of thoughts, as soon as I start that, I immediately start tensing my head, and then I relax it, and I'm like, okay, so I try to think about the drawbacks of this, but it keeps happening.
The sequence of practice should be as follows. You tackle the most ostensible impediment first.
Yeah.
Okay. So the fact that you're bringing this thing up means that it's that. It's one of the most ostensible impediment you're experiencing. So I think your intuition is serving you very well. This is why I guess you're asking about natural awareness and relaxing and heightened sensitivity and so forth. That would be very helpful in your case. I highly recommend you're doing that first before proceeding with the Dhamma base, Satipatthana. Once you have this foundation, it would be relatively easy for you to perform diagnosis on how you're using any technique whatsoever. Are you using it with too much straining? Are you using it with unnecessary tension? I mean, I understand that some tension is necessary in life, right? So without tension, I won't be able to sit up. I won't be able to open my mouth and utter these sounds. And so some tension is necessary. But if you're in the habit of examining what sort of exertions are unnecessary, not only are they not helpful, they're oftentimes sabotaging the very thing you're trying to do. Right? So develop that kind of discernment. And then so that your actions become very efficient. When you walk in a very leisurely. Right? When you speak, you could speak inwardly. It feels like you're doing this while being comfortable in your skin. You're not like trying to prove a point, trying to convert people, ready to fight when people disagree with you. And, like things like that. You'll be more sensitive about what needs to be done right now. How do you do it efficiently? And how do you readily come back to rest? Readily let go of unnecessary baggage. Train yourself in that. Treat it as like an open-ended quest. There's no point of a perfection, and you're not striving for it. You're not striving for perfection, but you treat it as an ongoing inquiry. It's something you can always adjust, adapt, improve. That's part of the bodily base Satipatthana, really. Or if you don't like that long-winded explanation, here's a shorter one. Okay? Keep finding better ways to relax. Keep ferreting out tension in your being. Keep dropping unnecessary tension in your being. Wherever you go, whatever you do, keep practicing that. It's going to be directly useful to the Dhamma-based Satipatthana in either case. The Dhamma-based Satipatthana entails you're knowing the drawbacks of Sankhara before you let it go, before you relinquish it. And what more obvious drawback than tension in Sankhara?
And I have a question about idle chatter. So, the Buddha told the monks, be quiet or talk about the Dhamma.
Yeah.
And, when I'm with my Dharma friends, is that the same standard that we should follow?
Yeah. Whether you're with anyone, learn to enjoy peace. Instead of treating the be quiet as a injunction, okay? So don't treat it as an injunction. Don't stop talking for its own sake. For most people, that's going to backfire. That's going to have an inimical effect on your social skills, on your sense of well-being, on how fulfilled you are. So don't treat that as an injunction. Instead, learn to enjoy quiet. Learn to savor the moment of silence, not as boredom, not as instances of suppression, but as genuine rest, as taking a break, enjoying vacation. Like vacation doesn't cost anything. Learn to associate the image of a silent person with someone who is dignified and noble and profound. Right? So if you look at, for example, two people quarreling, and then one is more or less silent, and the other one is animated, right, enraged, and so forth. learn to see that as a wise person being picked on by an unwise person, in other words, right? So learn to associate the right kind of perception with the act of silence. Don't in general, I don't like treating it as a categorical rule. Like you go into a retreat and go, okay, you cannot speak for the 10 days. Speech has its function. You just have to know that your speech comes from a place of peace, comes from a place where you are always detecting tension. Learn to improve your social skill. It doesn't mean that you have to be gregarious, right? And hang out with people, party a lot, and put yourself in leadership position. I don't mean it that. But I mean that to cultivate holistic happiness, you want to do what you can to tend to different aspects in your life. And the social aspect is a very important aspect. The Buddha praises solitude, but that doesn't mean that you're in solitude 24 hours a day. And learn to, like when you're with people, you know, this doesn't mean that you have to learn to be articulate, eloquent, and use really flowery words. And no, but you're genuine, you're sincere, and even maybe in our own style, maybe we use very plain spoken language. We could effectively communicate our meaning, our feeling, right, without embellishment, right, without other concerns. If you could do that right, it will be a great confidence booster. So I would go against, Buddhist conventional wisdom and recommend that on the one hand, you enjoy silence, but on the other hand, don't overlook the power of having healthy social life. It's very hard to imagine that when you're always silent or when you're all categorically preferring silent, that you can have healthy social life. It's hard to imagine that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Are we going to be looking at the formal spaces next week
Yes.
instead? Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
And in the Satipatthana Sutta, it talks about doing it externally. Is that like reading body language?
Yeah, so the Buddhist sects disagree with each other, right? What constitutes the outer senses, the outer body, and so on. So they don't agree. So we don't have to resolve that controversy here. So I think that a plausible explanation of that phrase is that you're contemplating on the behavioral patterns of other people. Many modern meditators are under the impression that Satipatthana is always about your own inner experience, is always about the present moment. That's not the case. The way Satipatthana is presented in the sutras, it can be about you're recollecting a past event, right? You're applying a sort of retroactive insight to it. That's entirely possible. That can be done, right? And then also, it's not just about your inner experience. It's also about noticing behavioral patterns of other people. Oftentimes, you'll find that very sobering. You'll find that very enlightening. Looking at the stupidity, the follies perpetrated by others. You must have had the following experience. You look at a foolish thing done by the other, and in your mind, you're filled with disenchantment. You're like, let me be not like that. Let me not be like that, right? Or that maybe you're filled with a sense of dismay or a sense of danger, where you go, if I'm not careful, I may end up like him, stupid fool like him, right? So paying attention to behaviors in general is helpful. It doesn't matter whether it's coming from your side or to other people's, on the part of other people. In fact, in the ultimate sense, there's not a meaningful boundary to be drawn between you and other people in that regard. How so? Let's say you have the power to recollect your past lives, right? And you remember, oh, in one of your previous lifetimes, you were the thieving, heedless, amoral, person. And then to the extent that there's no longer emotional investment in that particular character, it's almost as if you're looking at the story of a stranger, right? Doesn't it? I'm sure that of the numerous lifetimes you're able to recall, you don't emotionally relate to all of them equally. Some feel like distant past or completely unrelated to you, right? And then some feel closer to you where you could identify more easily with the characters in them. So there are instances where you will be able to remember what is supposedly your past, but then there's no emotional connection. It's like you're looking at a stranger. And conversely, we can look at a stranger. And the thing that she is doing, the thing that he is experiencing, we could totally relate. It's almost as we're looking at ourselves and we suffer vicariously, right? And we worry very intensely about what happens to the person. Like when you're reading a novel, when you're really engrossed in a movie, right? So to what extent is this experience the experience of the strangers or mine experience? In what sense? It's only in the sense that you're emotionally connected with that emotion that it can potentially feel like yours. You put your sense of being therein. You embed your sense of self therein, that it becomes yours. Otherwise, the boundary between so-called you and other beings is really blurred. In very close examination, who am I? What is this person? What is this boundary? The so-called my preferences, are they really my preferences? Or have I been brainwashed by my parents, by my race, by my country, by my political party, by my religion, by the genes imparted to me by my ancestors, so on and so forth. All these factors, all of which are really not self, all of which are really impersonal. But then potentially you could have an emotional connection. So it doesn't really matter if you're looking at other people's behaviors or looking at quote unquote your behavior, so long that the understanding induce the right kind of sentiments, such as disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, maturing, and letting go.
Thank you.
Okay.
Drive safe.
Okay, you too.
And what's the difference between cessation and letting go?
These terms, not just cessation and letting go, but also disenchantment, also seclusion, and also dispassion, sometimes they're synonyms. Sometimes they represent successively deeper or more profound type of liberation conducive sentiments. So there are suttas where they're treated as synonyms. For example, there's a sutta that says that what is seclusion? The ultimate seclusion is nibbana. Yet, according to other suttas, seclusion is supposed to be one of the more superficial liberation conducing sentiments. Right? Supposedly you start out with seclusion, and then you move on to maybe disenchantment, maybe then to dispassion, then maybe to cessation, then maybe to letting go. So sometimes they're synonyms. Cessation is letting go. Sometimes they are not synonyms. They are sequentially linked. Okay, how so? Well, what sort of disenchantment should you practice? You need to practice the kind of disenchantment that would mature in dispassion. It is possible to practice a kind of disenchantment that doesn't mature in dispassion, right? You could practice foulness contemplation and end up becoming very pessimistic, end up being pathologically depressed, end up being wanting to commit suicide. That's entirely possible. Disenchantment can do that, right? So as we're practicing any one of these liberation-conducing sentiment, we keep within our purview. Where is this leading us to? You continue to self-correct course as you're moving closer to the goal. And as you're moving closer to the goal, the resolution gets better. You have a better idea what the goal is like. And then based on the feedback, you know how to adjust, right? You know what kind of disenchantment is naturally linking up to dispassion. And then you understand what sort of dispassion is naturally linking up to cessation. Okay. And then you understand how all of these, when they brought to maturation, will lead to just general letting go, which is really the ultimate objective of the Dharma. You know, the word seclusion, right? It's given such great variety of definitions in both Buddhist and non-Buddhist texts. In, say, the non-Buddhist Upanishads, for example, the word seclusion frequently means you're being able to create a distance so that you're not completely fused with phenomena. Right? Once you create a distance, you could afford to look into the fact that I am not that phenomenon. The phenomenon is not myself. Right? So seclusion could be something superficial, or it could be something very fundamental. It's really just letting go. It's another way of saying letting go.
Is there a type of cessation that doesn't lead to letting go?
Hypothetically, you could say that some traditions will argue that cessation equals suicide, right? Or some tradition, I mean, there are really contemporaries of the Buddha who advocated that when you shut your eyes, the world disappears, right? When you shut your ears, the world disappears, right? In other words, you're advocating a sort of sensory deprivation as a way of weaning off craving. So yeah.
All right, great. Thank you.
Dr. Chu,
Hey, hello, Alice.
can you talk more about the awareness, being, and Nibbana?
Okay. The early suttas really don't use the word awareness, right? It doesn't, right? But in later forms of Buddhism and also in non-Buddhist contemplative traditions, people use awareness a lot. And I think that the way it's used, sometimes it could be the same as the non-manifestive consciousness in early Buddhism. Those two things can potentially be the same. They can potentially be, it depends on how the different traditions, different teachers explain it, right? But they can potentially be the same. Yeah. So even in other religions or in, the non-early Buddhist traditions, people will differentiate between consciousness and awareness. So consciousness is a sort of self-perpetual behavioral loop which contain means of self-preservation. So in other words, thoughts are generated so that the thinker identity can be preserved. Feelings are felt so that the feeler identity can be preserved. Perception is given rise to, so the identity of a perceiver is preserved. That's kind of like the role of consciousness. And even at a very small scale, when you look at, say, a plant seed, right? When you look at human DNA, right? Human genomes, they have those characteristics. Why are they there for? I mean, they don't serve some kind of cosmic purpose that we can tell, but they're self-serving. They're preserving some sort of behavioral loop, some sort of patterns, right? We call memory. These patterns are just self-perpetuating. Why do you want to crave? Why do you want to crave for happiness? So I can crave for more happiness. I can do more craving for more happiness. Craving seems to be purposeless. It doesn't serve a higher function. Other than that, it's self-perpetuating. And consciousness is like that. Now, awareness, on the other hand, it's not like that. Right? There is no agenda. There is no drive to self-preserve, to self-perpetuate. And subjectively, no suffering is produced because there's no intention that buys into the literality of the content of the thoughts generated in that consciousness. Yeah. There are so many different ways we can talk about this, right? So in this way of explaining, awareness is Nibbana. Yeah. It is not intention driven, right? It doesn't require a station for it to manifest itself, for it to define itself, right? It's not engaged in a self-perpetuating activity. I need to feed myself. I'm looking for happiness. I want to continue to exist. I'm going to become that. I'm going to blah, blah, blah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
老师，我有个问题，我想用中文说一下。
Okay, of course, I'll translate for you.
OK， 就是没有那个 experience 和觉知哈，没有觉知的 experience 哈，但是我能说这个 experience 是从觉知上产生的吗？这个觉知 ，yeah.
So your question was that, we frequently talked about how there is no experience independent of awareness. But is it the case that experiences are produced or caused by awareness, right? That's fair, right? So experience by definition is infused with, pervaded by awareness, right? Experience is always self-reflective, meaning that for it to be an experience, it has to be something that's felt by you. You're aware of it, right? So in that sense, awareness is always a substratum of all experiences, or you could say that awareness is a universal quality of all experiences. There are different ways of saying. Now, on the other hand, when you say, is it the case that awareness is kind of like a font, it's kind of like a source, it's kind of like God, right? Giving rise to or creating experiences. That's a perception. That's an interpretation. Causation is not self-evident. We never directly observe causation. What we observe is a sequence of events. And when they happen together enough time, we assume, we infer causation, right? And such an inference can potentially be wrong. So for example, when little kids continue to experience first the roosters calling in the morning, followed by the sun rises. And this is repeated 20 times. And the kid goes, see, the rooster has woken up the sun. The sun rise because the rooster called him to wake up. Right? So the kid is attributing causation to the sequence of phenomena. Right? But this, maybe one time in his life, when there was no rooster around, the mother just cooked the rooster for Thanksgiving. And the sun still comes up the next morning. Right? The thing about inferential knowledge is that you can never know for sure. You can repeat it 1,000,000 times. You can repeat it for 1,000,000,000 times, but you can never know for sure. You can see that you fire a gun and the bullet shoots out. It's, this mechanism causes the bullet to shoot out. Right? And we could duplicate that chemical reaction, the physical reaction, right? The mechanism. We could duplicate it 1,000,000,000 times. We could never arrive at epistemic certainty where we go, there is causation. Indeed, this caused that. No, we never know that. Causation is always interpreted. It's always inferred. Does that make sense? So, what is it that you see when you look at awareness? Is it really that awareness causes experience? You never directly see that. You may assume so, right?
Yeah.
Now, that assumption can potentially be useful. It can potentially be useful, right? We could talk to each other. When you use this perception and communicate with me, I understand what you're talking about, and we could talk. All right, so it could potentially be useful. Now, the Buddhist meditation is such that you can continue to harbor perceptions and arrive at truth. You can attain full liberation without having to necessarily drop all the perceptions altogether and experience perfect signlessness. That's not a requirement. But it could be potentially very useful if you work on dropping unnecessary perceptions along the way. Just keep dropping. Just keep moving along. Keep moving up the ladder of the formless attainments. The loftier the attainment, the more rarefied the perception, meaning that more perceptions have dropped. And the suttas talked about the so-called signless meditation, the animitta. And the signless, at least in some suttas, is given a very high status, if not the highest status. If you practice satipatthana in a signless state, it's a very powerful way of practicing satipatthana. So now that you're given such an instruction, you have options. On the one hand, you can continue to perceive. You can choose to perceive that, awareness produces experience. And it will not necessarily detract from your satipatthana practice. Or the second alternative would be, you're learning to drop even that perception and see if you could arrive at a more direct, more immediate, more non-conceptual way of looking at experience, looking at the nature of mind. In the end, what we'll see, when all concepts are dropped, what we'll see, it's indescribable. It's indescribable, right? The different Buddhist traditions, they struggle to put it in word. That when you see something, when you cognize something, when you think you perceive something, when you understand something, as long as you're invoking ideas, as long as you're invoking memories, as long as you're invoking references, it's a second order knowing. It's not direct knowing. You're just imagining things. You're interpreting things. But what is that direct knowing about? What do you see in an instance of direct knowing? And then they debate. Some Yogacarans will tell you that you see emptiness. That's actually a pretty neat way of saying, in an instance of direct cognition, direct seeing, you cannot even see impermanence. You cannot even see impermanence. Why not? Impermanence suggests change. How do you know that things change? Because you are still resorting to memory. You remember that you breathed in a second ago, and now you're breathing out. So you say, breaths are changing. You remember that there's a beginning of your anger, and now you look at the anger and, it changes. It's fading, or it's changing intensity, whatever the case might be, right? So impermanence is not direct cognition, at least according to some Buddhist tradition. When you really drop your ideas, what do you see? You're at a loss for words.
So, okay. So in that case, I thought, before I think that I am I'm looking for self, right? So I found God. I look for God. I found self, right? So God is create everything. So in this case, I cannot say I looking for self. I found God, right?
That's one of the reasons that the Buddha remained non-theistic, right? So it's not that the Buddha was militantly and ontologically atheist. He wasn't like that. But he is pragmatically a non-theist. What use is there when you hold the interpretation that your awareness is God and has given rise to all this phenomena? There's relatively little usefulness. Meditatively, maybe it'll serve you maybe there's some utility to be had. But then if you use this as a way of, this is the truth, right? This is the way things are. And you go about debating with people and try to convert people to this version of reality. What use is that?
Yeah, right. Okay. So
there are meditation teachers, like in the past, I went to Ajahn Jeff and I asked him, well, on the one hand, I looked at Forest Theravada tradition teachers like Ajahn Dun, who said that your awareness is a substratum of the whole universe. There's only your awareness. There's nothing else. There's only the heart. There's nothing else, right? So there's this teaching on the part of Forest tradition, which you, Ajahn Jeff, recognizes as legitimate, authoritative, credible, right? On the other hand, you have, say, some Vajrayana school, such as Dzogchen, that talks about awareness being the font of all things, being the kind of like the creator of all phenomena. What's the difference between the two? Why is it that one is right? Why is it that one is wrong? And by the way, I'm not saying that I necessarily fully agree with Ajahn Jeff on this issue, right? But the answer he gave was that the Forest tradition doesn't imply that there's a causative relationship between the two. In other words, the Forest tradition talks about awareness, talks about the phenomena, but it doesn't talk about, awareness is responsible for creating phenomena.
Oh, okay.
The sort of insertion is unnecessary.
Right.
And then the Vajrayana, they do. So they're problematic in that regard. Okay. And forgive me if I'm not representing Ajahn Jeff's position correctly, but nonetheless, maybe we'll leave him out of the equation, right? And just have this conversation on our own. And I would agree with that in a qualified sense. So why do I say qualified? Because number one, it's not the case that all Vajrayana schools agree that there's a causative relationship between awareness and phenomena. That's not the case at all, right? And then number two, even if you say awareness creates all phenomena, you may be saying so provisionally. You may be saying so heuristically. You may be saying so phenomenologically. It doesn't have to be turned into a dogma.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily lead to reification. It doesn't necessarily have to lead to strengthened attachment, right? It doesn't have to. even when you use such a perception. It can potentially do, but it doesn't have to.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yes.
So how to use it? Like, it means that how you use it can directly lead to
It can be one of the formless perceptions. One of the variations of the boundless consciousness is like this. When you look at all things and you go, everything here is a manifestation of my mind, kind of like creations of my mind. If
Yeah.
you hold that
Right.
perception, it can be very useful.
Right.
When you hold that perception, right, everything is just a manifestation of my mind. And you examine all your attachments, all your mental defilements within that frame, things are put into perspective. You will have your relationship with these things will be altered.
Okay.
Like for example, for sensual craving to occur, we usually think about, oh, she's out of my league. She's too good for me. Look at how beautiful she is. When I'm with her, I'm so excited, right? To have the sort of passionate, obsessive relationship with this person, you really have to see her as, flesh, like body and flesh, someone who's outside me, who's beyond me. And if I get to be with her, it's a reflection of my status, it's a reflection of my power. On the other hand, if you look at the same experience, the mental impressions of the supposed person, the feelings that's supposedly related to this person, all as manifestations of awareness.
Right.
Immediately, your relationship with that intentional object is changed.
Right. So it is like I'm everything, right? Yeah. I am everything.
Potentially that can lead to that perception. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there's no distance between, right?
Sure, that potentially it can lead to that perception too. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's a useful perception, right?
It can be. Not that it is, but it can be a useful perception. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the direct way to get rid of the craving is like from the satipatthana. So from the mindfulness about the mind, the body, and
no, the satipatthana can be practiced while you're in first jhana, while you're in fourth jhana, while you're in the formless states. This is quite clear, except maybe with the possible exception of the eighth state, based on neither perception or non-perception. There were a few suttas that kind of added these caveats about how while you're in this particular formless space, you can't do satipatthana concurrently. You can't do it while you're abiding. You can do it after you come out from it. Yeah. But even that's kind of controversial. That's debatable, right?
Oh.
But with the other seven, there's no question that the early suttas agree that satipatthana can be done in all of them. It's not the case that you come out from the jhana, jhanas are frozen trances, and insight is only possible when you emerge from them. That's not the case at all.
Yeah, I think get rid of the craving. I think in my experience, it's like if I'm at peace and the craving, there's a craving coming out. I know it's a suffering, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. The suttas talked about how you can experience equanimity in first jhana. You can experience equanimity in second jhana. You can, there is equanimity to be had in the base of neither perception or non-perception. There's equanimity or peace, right, associated with any one of these states. And then you can use this peace, you can use this equanimity to diminish the craving. That's possible. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Dr. Chu,
hey,
can you talk about the meditation techniques that the Zen school teaching?
Too broad of an issue. You need to narrow it down for me. So many different Zen schools, right? Okay. So many time periods, so many regional variations, and
Okay.
Yeah.
So the techniques that I know is like they focus on the consciousness, and the seventh consciousness is the one that in between the sixth and the eighth.
Yeah. That's not Zen.
That's not Zen.
That's not Zen. That's Yogacara. That's
Oh.
Yogacara. So I understand that there are contemporary Zen teachers or contemporary teachers who style themselves as having come from a Zen tradition, right? And then they kind of liberally employ teachings from different Buddhist traditions. So technically, historically, this notion of seventh consciousness and eighth consciousness didn't come from Zen at all. In many ways, Yogacara is the opposite of Zen. Yogacara is considered to be very pedantic, very encyclopedic, very detail-oriented, very scholastically based, right? Zen is kind of like the opposite, at least, the romanticized image of Zen is kind of like the opposite of what I just said about Yogacara.
So Yogacara
Yogacara.
is more like a Mahayana school.
It's debatable. There are Yogacara exegetes, teachers who are evidently Mahayana, right? However, that's a loaded term in itself. Okay, so that's a whole other issue. And you can it's entirely possible that you look at Yogacara as, potentially not concerned with the vehicular affiliation. Well, it's Hinayana, it's Mahayana, it's blah, blah, blah. It's very useful to think of at least the oldest strands of Yogacara as epistemology. How do you arrive at immediacy? What constitutes direct cognition? What sort of things we take for granted when in fact they are conceptual overlay? They are ideas, they're concepts, they're inferred knowledge, and therefore not ultimately trustworthy. Right? These are the Yogacaran concerns in the oldest strains. And I understand that later on, Yogacara become combined with the Bodhisattvic ideals and become Mahayana and so on and so forth. But, Yogacara in its purest form is not concerned with whether it's the Arahat path, whether it's the Bodhisattva path.
Well, are you familiar with the technique where they saying that we direct our consciousness, our attention to a point that's not like to a doubt, like is not something that the mind can stick to. That's why they raise the question, like before you were born, how will you look like?
Okay,
so
you're mixing quite a few things actually. Yeah, you're so the first issue you raised, it's a Yogacara issue, and now you're talking about something called the Gong'an or the koans. The koans. That's a completely separate technique. Historically, they're not practiced in conjunction. Yeah, and then they have different inner mechanisms.
You say koan, how do you spell that?
Koan with a diacritical mark over A. That's a Japanese from the Chinese Gong'an or ancestral records, right? Public records. Public records.
So it sounds complicated then. But well, the technique is like this. So they direct the attention, the consciousness to the point that there's doubt, no point to attach. But I was practicing a while. It seemed to work, but only one part there. It doesn't make sense to me. Is normally awareness is all the time.
Okay, right? So this is the thing. People oftentimes talk about Buddhist schools, Buddhist techniques out of context, and they're mixing up a lot of different things. So there's a lot of confusion involved. And I don't know where to begin, but suffice it to say that koan has undergone a long history of evolution. So when people talk about koan, they don't necessarily refer to the same thing. They can refer to very different ways of meditative practice. Okay. The koan, as far as I could tell, originally, it was very akin to a kind of Buddhist self-inquiry, where you ask yourself spiritually meaningful questions that will help go on your inquiry. Like, what am I like before I was born? And the purpose behind this inquiry is to help you understand that this crude personality that you have come to identify with is an acquired one. It is possible through gradual pacification of fabrication or sankhara that you arrive at your primordial state. You arrive at awareness state. So originally it started out like that. And then koan becomes something that's no longer primarily about the inquiry part. It's primarily about your focusing on the feeling of doubt. So by the time of around 9th century China, Song Dynasty, later Tang Dynasty, China, the koan practice is no longer about, it's not so much about the actual content of your inquiry, that the line of reasoning you perform, sort of inner, investigation you perform. It's more about focusing on the feeling of doubt. And therefore the maxim, the greater the ball of doubt there is, the greater the awakening. Small doubt, small awakening. No doubt, no awakening. Right? And still later on, koan becomes this ritualized exchange between teacher and disciple. It's really a ritual. It's not even about focusing on the doubt anymore, the feeling of doubt itself anymore. It's about your enacting a known exchange in the past with the hope of sometimes to reap karmic merit. You're just imitating the conversation style. You're just performing it because, that's what your Rinzai school expects you to do, ritually, and so forth. So it depends on what kind of koan you're talking about.
The way I understood was different. It's not the feelings, it's to direct the mind to the point that is confusing, like it's no answer. So there's nothing to attach.
Yeah, so you're talking about basically the second type of koan I was talking about. You're
no
focusing on the
attachment.
feeling of doubt itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like no attachment until it trick the seventh consciousness until it's fully.
That's not koan anymore. No, that's a mingling. That's this particular teacher's liberally mingling together two things.
Yeah,
and,
maybe
and both of these are no longer practiced in their original context. So I have no idea what he's talking. The way you work with the seven consciousness is never the way that particular teacher described, not historically. Yeah. So personally, and by the way, I would never presume to say that a certain technique is utterly useless, right? It's just completely bad. I would never presume that. But generally speaking, I will not recommend people taking up the kind of koan practice where you focus on the feeling of doubt. That's a recipe for a lot of common Zen illnesses. You'll end up with headache, you'll end up with agitated body, you'll end up with a lot of physical and psychosomatic ailments. Likely. I've seen so many examples. I would not recommend. You're staying hours on end focusing on the feeling of doubt. Really not good. You can use keen interest. You can use deep curiosity as potential tools in your satipatthana practice, in your self-inquiry. That's good. That's good. But you have to know how to balance them with the 7 factors of awakening.
No, the word curiosity, maybe that better than the word I use.
Then you're no longer just focusing on feeling doubt. You're practicing the koan the first way. You're doing a sort of self-inquiry-like practice. And typically, the self-inquiry type of practice, you work with phenomenological categories of experience. Seventh consciousness is, for that purpose, would be considered by a lot of teachers as being too philosophical. It doesn't lend itself easily to self-inquiry type of practice. If your self-inquiry is about, what does this mean? Right? And that's very good. That is very good. Right? Or you're asking yourself, in what is directly experienced here and now, what part is peace or at peace or not perturbed or not changing? That would be good. Right? It's very phenomenological. It's just about this experience right here. The self-inquiry, it typically doesn't involve your philosophizing over, like a metaphysical issue. The Yogacara system has its own meditation system, but it's not the way this particular teacher describes. It has its own meditation system, a very robust one for that matter.
Hi, Dr. Chu.
Hey, Mason.
The conversation made me curious. What are your thoughts on shikantaza practice or silent illumination? Just kind of totally unintentional, undirected, just passive kind of practice?
When we look at the early suttas, there are many examples where the Buddha would impart a very straightforward lesson, a very terse one, right? A pithy instruction on non-directedness as a liberation gate, and the person becomes liberated. So once again, I will never presume to say, oh, this kind of practice is utterly useless or just categorically wrong. But just coming from the limited experience that I have, if a person is not properly inspired in right resolve and not endowed with right view, right? Not understanding what the goal is, right? Not understanding very basic things like what constitutes craving. How do we learn to recognize it in our experience? Or what constitutes suffering? How do we recognize it? What constitutes the selfing activity and how to recognize it and so forth. And you just tell the person you just sit away. And then thinking that just sitting would magically and equally efficaciously bring everyone to more or less the same result. I'm highly skeptical of that. Right? I have seen people who eventually revert to really very crazy ideas about Buddhism after decades worth of shikantaza teaching. So it's not necessarily that, having done this for decades onward, you will automatically converge in understanding with every other meditators who are properly initiated. So there is that. There is this aspect, there's this potential downside to it. But on the other hand, there's benefit to that approach. I have seen a lot of meditators losing interest in the practice because their way of practicing is way too formal, is way too rigid, right? Whenever you think about meditation, you think about, I have to set aside this 1 hour, I need to put myself in a cross-legged position, and then throughout this time, ideally, I will continuously be implementing the Satipatthana techniques. When oftentimes in our everyday life, what we need is oftentimes a very free-flowing style kind of practice. And we want to be able to find intermittent rest, even amidst activities. And we want to have a natural attitude about meditation instead of always thinking about formal practice, which has its benefit. Sometimes you learn to look at meditation as something very natural. It's as natural as you're taking a walk in the garden. You're taking a break from your study, and then you do a little leisurely stroll in the garden, right? And having that kind of attitude sometimes is more conducive to, say, a lead form. So the shikantaza attitude can be a tool, but in general, if you treat it as the only tool or the primary tool or the end all be all, then once again, in my limited experience, I don't think of it as a particularly beneficial way to practice.
Related to that, how could I bring discipline into my practice without falling into just a formal structure?
Yeah, hopefully you want to be able to do both, right? You enjoy the casual mode and you enjoy the formal mode. Why is it that people self-willingly impose discipline? Why do they do so? Well, one very compelling reason is that it sometimes feels good to lead a structured life. When you have discipline and when you see yourself as a disciplined person, you take pride in that. You feel grounded, for example. You feel like your life is not, being squandered away. Right? I think back in my most studious years when I would lock myself up in the room and just, literally read all day, right? Steeped in the sutras and so forth. Now that has its measure of suffering for sure, but a lot of it was sweet memory for me. I recall those days where I really feel like, wow, I'm really grounded. I'm not wasting time. I love it, living like that. I was once talking to a dorm roommate about how I'd be perfectly content if I were to live the rest of my life like that, or sharing public bathroom with 20 other students on the same floor, and then other than the occasional stroll in the court, it's just reading the suttas, right? So you want to read your mind, understand what kind of discipline it will happily accept, right? You could push its envelope, but don't push it that the seams fall apart, the envelope breaks, right? You're going to be able to see that there's the right amount of structure. It's kind of like doing yoga. For a asana to be very effective, you want to stretch kind of to your limit and then some, and then relax and breathe into it, right? That's when the asana will be particularly effective for you, right? In the same way too, if in your everyday life you give yourself the right amount of challenge, mild challenges, that's how you will become alive. That's how you will ward off Alzheimer's. Right? That's probably one of the most effective ways of preventing Alzheimer's is to give yourself the right amount of challenge. Now, too much challenge, it creates stress. And it actually brings on Alzheimer's. Right? But the right amount of challenge, you feel good about yourself. And you're moving in a direction. You feel like you have a purpose. Discover the joy that comes from disciplining oneself. Yeah, basically. Go ahead.
How can I improve the volume and consistency of my energy throughout the day?
One of the things you can do is you can make this the main topic of your meditation for the entire day, i.e. your energy level. Right? So throughout the day, you look at things like your energy baseline. Okay, if I were to use a new agey terminology, you look at the frequency at which you vibrate, right? And then you look at outside of this baseline, say when you're talking, when you're walking, when you're thinking about things, how much energy are you expending? Now, for a lot of people who suffer from chronic torpor when they meditate, I notice this common thing. That is, their energy baseline is way too low. You don't have to wait until they sit in the right posture and then they start dozing off. You don't have to even wait until then. It's in there every day, even at their baseline level. They're vibrating at the wrong frequency. So you look at yourself and you go, okay, the baseline has to be something that's sustainable. You can be comfortable in it, right? You don't really have to strive or strain yourself to maintain it. But then you could subtly adjust it so that you are a little more passionate, maybe. A little calmer, maybe. A little bit driven by zeal, for example. In your breaths, right? If you're someone whose baseline is tending towards being too low, then learn to frequently breathe energizing breaths. If your baseline energy is a little on the higher end, then learn to breathe soothing breaths frequently. Just monitor to adjust your baseline. So you start out with that, and then you become watchful of how you're expending your energy, how you're conserving your energy. Make this the main topic of your meditation for the rest of the day. When you're talking, you're paying attention. This is how I'm exerting myself. This is how the energy is expended. And this is how I'm conserving my energy. I didn't have to talk in this animated way. I didn't have to, worry about having to convince you, right? That's unnecessary energy. You're monitoring this, conserving. And whenever you're expending energy, you're expending it judiciously, expending it maybe frugally. You can apply this technique to slow jogging. I highly recommend it. To meditators in general, because most meditators I know, they don't have enough exercise in their everyday life. So slow jogging is a very good exercise, right? So while you're slow jog, or you watch some YouTube clips about how to do that. It's really an exercise that potentially doesn't have to make you pant, make you out of breath. You could do it all the while being able to practice Satipatthana, right? So do slow jogging and do this practice, monitoring your energy level at the same time. And sorry, I interrupted you, Mason.
No, I'm just wondering how to distinguish between expending energy unproductively and raising my passion level, right, or even exercising.
Okay, so don't set up in your mind some mark of perfection and then trying to reach it. Don't do that. Make this an open-ended query. You're just experimenting. You're just looking, this is how I'm expending energy. This is how I'm conserving energy. How can I do it better? Keep that open-ended. You don't know the answer yet. Discover for yourself. How do you walk in a way so that you feel good? You're not hurried all the time. How do you talk in a way that you can talk for hours on end and properly communicate your passion to people and be at rest, be comfortable in your own skin, right? How do you, like when you're lying down on the floor in perfect corpse posture, right? See if even in such a state, you're expending energy unnecessarily. Or conversely, while you're running or while you're very busy, like rushing from one task to the other, see if you're able to conserve your energy, even when you're amidst such activities.
Thank you, that makes sense. Different question. So lately I've been monitoring how I feel when I watch television, as that's my sort of main bad central pleasure. And I've gotten to a point where I can kind of replicate that outside of that situation.
Yeah.
But I'm not entirely sure what to do with that state because it's not clear to me that it's, wholesome to just practice how that feels, right? So I'm not sure how to use it.
Mhm. When you say using it, you mean the equanimity that you're able to produce when shunning television? Is that what you're saying? Or
No, I mean, the kind of when I watch television, I can notice, oh, I like that that I don't have to make any decisions, that I can just relax, that my mind doesn't have to be
yeah,
at a
yeah,
high
okay,
level of awareness. Yeah.
okay, right. So a lot of people claim that, like playing with your cell phone, playing computer games, watching television is their favorite pastime. Okay. But I think it's very likely that such people, when they're more aware, they realize that it's not necessarily the activity itself that's giving them so much pleasure, but rather it's the incidentals. So for example, when you're watching television, it means that you don't have work to do. And you can throw yourself in sofa in whatever posture you like to, right? You don't have to worry about the clothes you're wearing. You don't have to worry about whether your hair is disheveled, right? It's properly combed, right? You don't have to worry about saying the right things to your wife and so forth, right? So it's oftentimes the incidentals, the environmental elements that really appeal to you. And it's when you are watching television, you also happen to put yourself in that informal state where those incidental benefits become available to you. So train yourself to make those incidental benefits available to you, even when you're not watching television, even when you're not playing video games. How do you make yourself feeling casual and informal, and you don't need to be so rigid, and you could be carefree, and you're leisurely, you have nothing else to do, you have no responsibility at the moment, right? When you're playing video games, it doesn't matter how many times you get killed. It's almost like a nonchalant, oh, okay, I'm going to start again, right? And that makes you feel good because there's no real stake, right? How do you duplicate that in your everyday life when you're not playing video games? You cultivate this attitude that there's really no, emotional stake in the thing that I do. Yeah.
Thank you. That's much clearer. Thank you.
I just have this curiosity question that if anyone need to ask question about meditation, go ahead, just interrupt. But I just want to ask you if you're familiar with this image, the Buddha holding I don't know if it's clear.
I can't see. It's all blurry. It's
yeah.
all blurry.
Okay, is the Buddha holding a lotus
Yeah.
and then asking
Yeah, Mahakassapa.
Kassapa,
Right.
and he just smile.
Yeah.
So that this is relate to what the other master teaching is.
How many times do you want me to make you feel depressed in a day?
No. I'm willing to take in. I want to understand I want to understand. No, go ahead.
It's a fabricated story.
Right? Oh, this one too?
Right. So he invented once again, in the Tang, in the Song Dynasty, China. And the Chan people have this romanticized understanding of their own lineage, being an unbroken one, continuous one, traceable all the way to the historical Buddha, right? So the historical Buddha was technically the first patriarch. Mahakashapa was the second patriarch. Ananda was a third, and it passed down all the way to the 28th, who was supposedly Bodhidharma. He went to China, became the first Chan patriarch in China, and blah, 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 blah. So number one, that patriarchal lineage is completely trumped up. So in Chinese history, there are many competing patriarchal lineages. The one that you're familiar with today is only legitimate because a certain individual in that tradition, Shen Hui, was politically connected. So he was given imperial blessing that his lineage was the authentic one. Right? And these stories have more to do with Neo-Taoism than with Indian Buddhism. In Indian Buddhism, you don't see anything similar, where the Buddha just plucked a flower and smiled and everyone goes, what the heck? And then only one person smiled back, right? And the Buddha goes, you understood me. There is a mind-to-mind transmission, right? The sort of, the evocative elements you find in this particular story are familiar ones in Neo-Taoism and not familiar ones in Indian Buddhism. In Neo-Taoism, there are plenty of these sages who, number one, they have to be illiterate. Okay, they cannot be well learned. And so they live outside the scriptural tradition. Number two, they arrive at enlightenment in a non-expected, spontaneous way. Someone hit them on the head. Oh, they become enlightened. Right? They saw a village girl passing by smiling at him and he become enlightened. Right? Or the teacher chopping down a Buddha statue and becomes enlightened. You hardly find precedents of such in Indian Buddhism, but you see plenty in Neo-Taoism. And this is why there are scholars who say that, Zen owes more in its spiritual orientation to Neo-Taoism than to Indian Buddhism. And by the way, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm not necessarily saying because so Zen is wrong or it's not an effective soteriology, but I'm just giving you some historical facts. Yeah.
Thank you. More question to come later.
I admire your mental fortitude, Venerable Amy. You are capable of withstanding the shattering of worldviews many times a day, right?
Well, good to learn different views and explore more. Like, I want to know the truth.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that with you, I can speak candidly. Yeah. And with other people, and I'll be talking about other things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Chu.
Hey, hello, Robert.
I had a question. This was it's related to eating again, and I guess it's kind of maybe a simple question, but I feel like I find it hard to differentiate sometimes between craving for food and physical hunger.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they're like seen as the same thing, or if physical hunger just leads to craving necessarily, like at least in my experience. So I was just kind of wondering.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I actually spend days making this my primary meditation topic, to differentiate between physical hunger and sensual craving, right? So my advice would be to start out with some tips, some general understanding, but then once you start investigating, keep it open-ended. So in other words, just keep looking. So what is it? How are they different? Right? It will be helpful to start out with some tips. So the Buddha described sensual craving using words like obsession, using words like passion, using words like fever. And here's another very important tip, there's a kind of hunger where you are experiencing physical discomfort, right? And to the extent that there is a desire to alleviate that physical discomfort, there's movement. On the other hand, there is a kind of hunger where your inner peace is disturbed, is squeezed, is compromised. So is it possible to have a kind of physical discomfort which instigate action, but then there's no mental peace that is disturbed? Is it possible? So these are just some helpful tips to keep in mind, and then make the investigation open-ended. Just be curious about it. And just look into your experience. And it will be very, very useful if you are able to identify the manifold expressions of craving, of sensual craving, the different ways it manifests. It can manifest in a way by hijacking the way you breathe, for example. It can manifest by ways of making you to be impatient, for example. It can manifest in a way where, you are, there is this mental scenario, there is a mental picture in front of you, and you couldn't wait to get in there. It's like you want to enter a dream very quickly. Right? There are many different ways that this manifests. Just be very interested in this. I want to figure out sensual craving. I'm going to put an end to my being a slave to it, being driven by it, being bombarded by it all the time. It's tiring. So I need to figure this out.
Thank you very much. That's extremely helpful.
So Robert, is it okay for me to ask if Robert and Robert M are just two people? You're just using two rooms, or are there actually two Roberts amongst us?
No, sorry. They're both mine. I
Okay,
have
I
one
see. Okay, good.
like on my computer and one that's
Yeah, I
on
was
my
looking at it.
phone
I go, okay,
on
there's
my
another
phone.
Robert that I
Yeah.
don't know yet. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
No. Anything else? If not, we could always wrap things up.
Yeah, Dr. Chu,
Sure, Jared.
the type of koan where it's the teacher and the student reenacting, is
Mhm.
there value in that?
The Buddha had a varied attitude towards ritual. Some rituals he categorically reject. Some rituals he accept with qualifications. Some rituals he endorse wholeheartedly, right? So these rituals are given different meanings, and then they were enacted in different contexts. And so it's very hard to generalize. Let me give you an example. There are rituals that has the effect of generating devotional attitudes, of generating humility in a person, which is awesome. Okay, religion is probably the most beautiful, most powerful in that regard, right? It's when you practice Buddhism as a religion versus when you practice Buddhism merely as a way of life, as a philosophical system, they bring about very different results. When you practice Buddhism as a religion, and by that I mean that it inspires this devotional feeling, and then you understand that there is really this sacred, inviolable, higher principle where you are rendered completely humble. You are insignificant in front of it, right? If you cultivate this type of feeling in you, it's very useful. It can be very good for you. And on the other hand, we also know that ritual can lead to superstition, it can lead to dogmatic thinking, right? It can lead to just simple waste of time, right? If it's not karmically negative, it's just karmically neutral. So probably better to take a nap where you could actually recharge yourself than to do it, right? So it depends. It depends on how you do it, what meaning you inject into it. Okay, so is that good enough? Shall I
Yeah,
call
thank
it?
you. Yep.
All right. See you guys. Bye bye. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Right.